Welcome to you. What we've done this week is translate the Feast of Saints Peter and Paul, which, from my point of view, is a lovely coincidence because I'm retiring this Sunday from a parish in which my two churches are St. Peter and St. Paul. Just thought I'd mention that, but we're translating them to the day before. So we're back in Matthew, and lovely little reading. Grace and Jerry, father-daughter team from the central USA, Midwest. Kelvin from the centre of the universe in Otipoti, Dunedin, and me. Lovely to have you on board. Kelvin is driving some background. Thanks.
Well, this is one of those passages which I think you've got to read it very closely in its context. And you look back, and the preceding passages are all about bread. The start of chapter 16, you've got the Syrophoenician woman, and Jesus talks about the bread falling from the table and the crumbs which the children can eat. Then you've got a couple of miracles, and then following that, the feeding of the 5,000. And then you've got this argument, Jesus and his disciples, about the bread, the yeast of the Pharisees. And then now you've got this passage, Peter's confession of faith. And the way we read the Bible in the West and in our churches, we tend to divide everything up. But I think these are actually all very closely connected, this whole idea of bread and of leaven. And a year or two ago, when I was reading the New Testament carefully, I noticed all the references to bread and decided I would make bread, and did it in the way that I imagined Jesus' mother would. So it was sourdough bread, which meant making a sourdough starter, and made bread. And I still do. Just come from a lunch of my own sourdough bread, and there's a bowl rising on the bench as we speak. But bread in that culture, you imagine as a little child, you're out playing in the village, and every house in the village with its courtyard and then the smoke from a wood fire rising, and then the smell of cooking bread. And you came into the house, and there were these big warm loaves which would be broken open and eaten with preserves or olives or whatever, and ingrained deep into people this the cultural significance of bread and the communal bonding of bread, and part of that was the sourdough. And there's a metaphor here. Beware of this, the yeast of the Pharisees, because we have the words that we use. And then we've got, this vast vocabulary of words, most of us, many thousands and thousands of words that we use. But underneath that is what you might call a hidden vocabulary. And that's the meanings that we attach to these words. If I say, I believe in God the Father, that may conjure up for me pictures of a protective and warm and loving presence. Or it may subconsciously conjure up pictures of a tyrannical or an absent or an unpredictable presence. And most of these inner meanings we put on words, this second vocabulary, this hidden vocabulary, are completely invisible to us. So we don't know that we mean something quite different by a word than somebody else does. And Jesus asks his disciples, what do people say about me? And they say actually all the usual things. And remember, this is coming after the yeast of the Pharisees. And then Jesus says to Peter, and what do you say? And Peter gives a response which Jesus recognizes as coming from deep within himself, from beyond this hidden vocabulary. Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, flesh and blood hasn't taught this to you. This is not the stuff you've picked up from your environment and your parents and so forth. But to know that you have been in touch with something profoundly deep. And then this bizarre presence, the bizarre thing, what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. And I think that's another way of saying that you're speaking truths which are true right through the whole depth of being and existence. I think that's my take on what that means.
Let's see where we go with that. Grace, let's ask you then what you find challenging, especially around this hidden language, but maybe with something else.
Yeah, I think this is a quite challenging passage in several ways. But one of the things that stands out to me that I'm still tussling with a little bit is a relationship that's described between the church and the kingdom of heaven, in that Peter is the rock upon which the church is built, and he's given the keys to heaven. And then there's this odd passage that describes, I use a weird translation. In mine, it says, the things that are bound on earth will be bound in heaven. The things that are loosed on earth will be loosed in heaven. And this is not generally the direction of the relationship between earth and heaven that we imagine. I think many of us tend to think of earth being affected, or hope that earth will be affected by heaven, rather than the other way around. And to be honest, I think it's quite unsettling and challenging to consider how genuinely our actions on earth have larger effects, especially given a long history of perceptions of Christianity as a faith that is more invested in the hereafter than in the here and now. That does not seem to be what Jesus is saying. It seems like whatever Peter is going to be doing, and perhaps us by extension, will indeed have significant consequences for heaven.
Well, thank you, I think, for a challenge like that, which both have your dad and your cat looking at you askance. So let's see what one or the other of them find challenging.
Well, I agree with her entirely. It's a scary thought. That wasn't where I was going to go with it, though. But you did very well. um, you can edit that out too. What I was thinking was more along the lines of where Kelvin started us. What we have in this passage are all these different declarations of God. What do people say? Well, they say you're one of the prophets. They say you're like Jeremiah. They say you're and all of these traditional things have all these, and they all, as Kelvin pointed out, bring their own baggage with them. But then even what Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, has different baggage for each listener, and we have to sort all of that out too. So the challenge is, even though this is ostensibly the passage where Jesus finally declares who he is, or rather finally allows the disciples to know that that's who he is, we still don't know until we've sorted all of the baggage out.
This you for that. Let's go to you one more time on this section, Kelvin.
Well, for my challenge, it is the bit that comes next. Peter has this revelation of who Jesus is, and it's affirmed by Jesus. And our spiritual life, that happens. You suddenly read something, hear something, feel something, and you enter a new depth of your spiritual walk. And there's the tendency, for me anyway, to think, wow, I've made it. Here I am. I've arrived. And you see this in Peter. He thinks but he's immediately upbraided, because it's not an arrival. It's a new beginning. He's on the starting line. He's not on the finishing line. And for me, that's a constant challenge, is that I'm continually finding that I'm lining up with, the beginners again, that it's always a start, always something deeper and newer to go on with.
All right, well, we'll sit with that. Jerry, we'll ask you, where's good news?
Well, that is the good news, that Jesus is more than all of our labels. So at one level, the basic good news here is that, yes, there is a Messiah. Yes, Jesus is the Son of God. Yes, God cared enough to take drastic action for our sake. So that is the gospel. That is the good news. But beyond that, there's the good news that no matter what labels we have put on Christ, there's more to learn. There's more there.
Thanks for that, Jerry. And now, Kelvin, can you broaden? Can you give us good news?
Well, good news is, for me, that there's two sets of naming going on here. There's Peter naming Jesus, but also Jesus calls Peter Peter. And when you look at Peter's histories up to this point, and even following this point, Peter the rock, there's not a less rock-like person in the whole of Scripture. I mean, it's a complete misnomer. But the name that Jesus gives him is what he will be, what he will become. And for me, that's the good news too, is that I don't know. I suppose Jesus calls me Kelvin. I think that's what he calls me. But he sees in me stuff that I don't see or that nobody else sees. But he knows what I can be and one day will be.
It's such a lovely image. Grace.
I'm still thinking about this sort of cosmology that's sketched out in this passage with earth and the church and heaven. And for me, the good news very simply lies in this one line about the church, that the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. I find myself thinking about evil quite a bit these days, and I am relieved to be reminded in passages that it will not win.
And important also that it's the gates of Hades. So Hades is not the one doing the attacking.
Yeah.
Hades is defending, and they can't stand.
Yeah.
All right. It's that wonderful mythology in poetry of the harrowing of hell. This is sort of all confusing around that. So, all right, let's apply all this and Kelvin, so what?
But so what is the same question that Peter gets asked?
Yeah.
What does everybody name Jesus? And there are 10,000 names drifting through our culture, and what do I call him? What name do I give him? And that's the so what that I live with every day.
Grace, for you, so what?
So my so what also is going to riff off of Kelvin a bit, because Peter probably would not have been my choice either for the rock of the church.
He might have been rock-headed.
I think there's a lot of alternatives. And what I think is really interesting is, we've got Peter and Paul, but when you look at sort of the trajectory of the church, we've inherited much more from Paul than we have from Peter. And so there is perhaps a question you could ask. I'm not asking, but you could ask of how effective was Peter as the rock of the church? But I think that is, in fact, the wrong question. My so what is that it was never about what he was going to accomplish. It was never about accomplishing anything. Because the thing he does right before he is named the rock is he proclaims that Christ is the Son of the living God.
And Jerry, a final word.
I really feel like we ought to stop with that. But,
Yeah.
But yes, Peter is the foundation of the church, I think precisely because he is such an unpromising specimen. And we don't know that he really ever got a whole lot better, except that he stayed faithful. Mm-hmm. We know that. And we know that he continued to proclaim. Mm-hmm. That's so what.
With that kind of dual focus on Peter, and in our readings we'll focus on Paul as well, so they both get a bit of a kick along this Sunday. But look, thanks for helping me through this one. It's a beautiful reading because it's so enigmatic, but Grace, Jerry, Kelvin, thanks for being on board.